Buenas and half a day, everyone. My name is Melvin Juanpat Borja. I am the director of the Commission on Decolonization and the president of the Department of Chamorro Affairs. Welcome, everyone, to Lumatla y Historiata, Critical Conversations, Organic Act, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We're really excited to have all of you here in attendance today. As you know, there's a lot going on today in celebration of the 75th commemoration of the signing of the Organic Act of Guam in 1950. As appropriate, the Organic Act of Guam was really meant to be a beginning of the establishment of a civilian government, self-government for Guam. And as many of you know, we are not quite at the precipice of this journey. But it is obviously important for us to continue these conversations, engage with each other in dialogue to help prepare us for the next steps and to help empower our younger community into carrying us forward. So thank you all for being here for this celebration. We will be inviting you to attend the festival, which is right across the street at the Plaza de España right after this. It's actually going to be kicking off before we end, but I'm happy that all of you have made time to be here today with us. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge some of our guests that are here with us today. From the 38th Guam Legislature, Senator Parkinson, Hafa Senator, thank you for being here with us. I'd also like to recognize former Senator Tom Adat, Hafa Senator, thank you for coming. Rosario Lemque, the Philippine Consul General. Adelina Jose, the Consul General of Palau. Chief Justice Philip Carbolito. Yumi Suda, Vice Consul of Japan. Former Senator Hope Cristobal. And I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of some of our sister agencies, Comisión y Finot Chamorro, the Office of Public Accountability, and of course, GVB. Thank you all for being here and supporting this event. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'd also like to recognize Ms. Judy Guthards. Thank you for attending. I'm sorry, I didn't catch you back there. All right. Just checking. Did I miss anybody? I have to ask. Did I? I did? Oh, yes. Former Senator B.J. Cruz here for OPA. Hafa Senator, thank you for being here. All right. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today. This is going to be a pretty loose format. The purpose of this is to help put this conversation in historical context. And of course, we want to have time for a discussion afterward. So today, you'll be hearing from three great speakers, including Polly Eric Forbes, former Congressman Dr. Robert Underwood, and Dr. Lisa Baza. I'll be introducing them as they come up to present. The way we're going to do this is that each one of them will give a brief presentation, and then we'll bring the entire panel up for a discussion shortly after. Okay, let's get started. Our first speaker, Polly Eric Forbes, OFM Cap, earned a BA in History at San Francisco State University in 1984. He earned his Master's of Divinity in 1990 from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He has also taken postgraduate courses in pastoral counseling at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and Franciscan Studies at St. Bonaventure University in Olean, New York. Polly Forbes is the Capuchin Superior for Guam and Hawaii. Born and raised on Guam, he graduated from Father Duenas Memorial School in 1980. Polly Forbes entered the Capuchin Franciscan Order in 1984 and was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1990. He was previously a pastor on Guam and Saipan and the Vocation and Formation Director for the Capuchin Order of Guam. Please help me in welcoming Polly Eric Forbes.
Well, just like the weather, this is unpredictable. Because the theme is our journey, past, present, future. And I was asked to speak on the future. And we're starting off with the future. So perhaps the first thing I want to say about moving towards the future is to ask if enough people want any movement at all. The last time the voters of Guam expressed their sentiment on the matter was 40-some years ago. 40-some years ago, the majority of Guam's voters did want to move forward towards a commonwealth. Can we maintain that same stance today, 40-some years later? Can the voters of 1982 represent the views of the voters of 2025? If we are to seek movement in the future, who gets to be involved in that motion? The people deprived of the right of self-determination in 1898, or that same description of people but in 1950, or everybody calling Guam home today? If everyday conversations with the average Tun Jose and Tan Maria that I have on this island is any indication about the pulse of the people, it can be argued that many people don't seem interested in making any movement at all. I get that impression not from what they say, but rather from what they don't say. The silence of the majority of people I come across every day suggests to me that the historical island way of just accepting what is decided for us and making the best of it is still very much the current island way. But it may come as a surprise to some of our people, when that will happen, if it ever happens, that the movement away from the status quo may not be initiated even by us, but rather by the United States itself. Guam's political status, first as a possession of the United States and now as an unincorporated territory, is all at the convenience of the United States. So the question is, what happens when it becomes inconvenient for the United States? When would some other arrangement be more convenient for the U.S.? Being unincorporated means we don't belong to the corpus, the body. It is a forced marriage where one spouse has the freedom to divorce, but not the other spouse. No one perhaps can imagine the United States releasing all claims on Guam and letting us go, but many things in history that did happen were not imagined years before it happened. Our separation from the United States, if that ever happens, may have absolutely nothing to do with us and what we want, but comes about because of new global realities that put the United States in a new frame of mind concerning the territories that were made territories with the understanding that these would never become states. Permanent and inseparable components of a country called the United States of America. States are what matter. So we're not as safe and sound as many people would like to think concerning our relationship with the U.S., and more people need to know that. That Guam politically is a creation of the United States Congress with intermittent interpretive rulings by the Supreme Court. And being a creation of Congress, we can be uncreated and perhaps recreated to suit the United States, or be uncreated and be left at that. If that doesn't spark a desire in people to be uncomfortable with the status quo, I don't know what will spark it. So if there is to be any movement regarding our political status, a lot more awareness needs to happen. It's been 40 plus years since political status was the talk of the town. A whole new generation of younger people are now in their 20s and 30s for whom political status is not on their radar. And if there's going to be any movement towards the future, it has to include them, and it has to include their political awareness. So more public education is needed. And if movement begins to happen, the people need to ask each other, where are we moving towards? A long and probably contentious process has to begin, where people of discordant and competing directions will argue. But at some point, something unifying has to happen, if there is to be any movement. In that heated and contentious process, the issues will become clearer, and a general direction most people can agree on may become possible. One of the points of contention will be who gets to be part of the discussion. If the descendants of those who were disenfranchised in 1898 are never allowed to vote in a binding referendum, would it be possible to have a non-binding referendum where only descendants of those denied a voice in 1898 get to express their political status preferences, so that at least we can say, as far as the people denied a voice all those years, finally have a voice. And that voice gets factored into the discussion as a clear indication where the descendants of the people in 1898 stand. The risk is that not enough descendants of that disenfranchised generation of 1898 will cast a vote. And in not casting a vote, are casting a vote for indifference and non-participation. Many of those who may never vote on political status are the skeptics who have given up before the fight even begins. How can David slay Goliath? Self-dignity behooves us to say something, even if Goliath steps on our toes or more. F.B. Leon Guerrero said 75 years ago that the Organic Act was signed into law by the grace of God and because of the righteousness of the United States. We can all thank the grace of God, even for sparing us a tsunami. As for the righteousness of the United States, I am reminded of the saying, the wheels of justice turn slowly. The United States doesn't always get it the first time, but it gets some of it some of the time. We can think of slavery, women's suffrage, desegregation, and so on. It is possible for us to keep applying moral pressure on the United States to be what it claims to be, a democracy where political authority is derived from the consent of the governed, rather than a nation of ex-colonies that in time collected its own colonies. If the United States is righteous, as F.B. Leon Guerrero said, it has to be reminded to be worthy of that attribute. Passivity and inertia were not the island ways of our ancestors thousands of years ago who got on boats and headed in a new direction. They first had to agree to make a move, to agree where to go to. The ocean did not take them directly and automatically to their new home. They had to deal with contrary winds and contrary currents. The question is if we, their descendants, will also be able to get in a boat, agree where to go to, and figure out how to negotiate contrary winds and currents.
Seduce Masi, Polly Forbes, and I apologize. Polly Forbes was supposed to go last. That was my fault. But you handled it well, Polly. Thank you. And I think it's very appropriate putting into context the way that we look at the present and the past, what has led us to this point. Our next speaker is Dr. Lisa Baza. Dr. Lisa Baza possesses over 30 years of experience in the field of behavioral health. During her career, she has held several government positions and is currently running a private clinic while serving as an adjunct professor at the University of Guam. She specializes in trauma-related counseling for individuals, couples, groups, and families with extensive expertise in assisting domestic violence victims, offenders, and their children, as well as providing training on trauma-informed practices and bullying prevention. Dr. Baza is a member and chairs the Ethics Committee of the Association of Individuals, Marriage and Family Therapists of Guam, and volunteers with Mapoksai Incorporated, advocating for improved access to care services. She is also a member of the American Counseling Association and the National Board of Certified Counselors, and previously served as a board member for the Commission on Decolonization. Dr. Baza is a product of our island's educational system. She has earned her Bachelor's of Science in Criminal Justice and Master of Arts in Counseling from the University of Guam and completed her doctoral studies at Capella University. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Baza.
Hafide, it is a privilege to join you today as we reflect on the 75th anniversary of the Organic Act of Guam, a moment long regarded as a turning point in our island's political history. And while the act marked a significant change, it was never intended to be the final destination. It was a calculated concession, a structural shift shaped by persistent and organized demands from the people of Guam. The act transferred authority from the U.S. Navy to the Department of the Interior. It established a civilian government and extended U.S. citizenship. But each of these gains came with sharp limitations. Our political reality became one of partial inclusion, citizenship without equal protection, participation without full representation, and governance without true sovereignty. The ambiguity in our status wasn't accidental. It was by design. As a licensed professional counselor, mental health counselor, marriage and family therapist, and educator, my career has focused on understanding how people, families, and communities recover from trauma and disruption, how they find their voice, reclaim their identity, and begin to move toward healing. What I've learned is this: healing begins with clarity. You must be willing to name the systems that have shaped you before you can truly transform them. In my field, we often speak of reauthoring, a therapeutic process where individuals and families reframe their experiences and begin to take ownership of their stories. That is exactly what our people have done long before 1950. From the petitions of 1901 to the Guam Congress walkout in 1949, the people of Guam have never stood idle. We have been organized, strategic, and rooted in a vision of self-governance. For me, this makes the story of the Organic Act not only political, it's deeply personal. It is the story of our collective identity, of navigating complex power dynamics, of preserving dignity across generations, and of working to move from fragmentation toward wholeness. What we are doing today is reflecting on the power of reauthoring, how the people of Guam have consistently challenged imposed narratives and reclaimed the right to author our own story. Every generation has added a new chapter. In the 20th century, our leaders rejected the passive role assigned to us and instead demanded meaningful self-governance. By 1936, they were in Washington, articulating a political vision rooted in equity and representation. The 1949 walkout of the Guam Congress wasn't just a moment of defiance. It was a narrative shift. It forced recognition. It altered the terms of our engagement with the United States government. These were not symbolic acts. They were deliberate revisions, strategic efforts to reshape our political reality. Since then, we've continued authoring change. We secured the right to elect our governor. We established a congressional delegate. We pursued judicial reforms. We reclaimed land and expanded local control. These developments have steadily deepened our civic and institutional capacity. Yet with every advancement, we've also had to confront the constraints that remain. We are still classified as an unincorporated territory. Our political development continues to unfold within a framework we did not choose. Some of the most impactful decisions about our future are still made far from our shores. And so we find ourselves at a critical point in this ongoing narrative, a moment that calls not just for reflection, but for intentional authorship. The path to decolonization is not simply about choosing among political status options. It's about readiness, readiness to take full ownership of our collective future, readiness to understand the complexities of statehood, free association, and independence, and readiness to lead ourselves with vision and competence. This is why the work of the Commission on Decolonization is so vital. Under the leadership of Melvin Wonpat Borja, the Commission is doing what every author must do before writing the next chapter: research, reflect, and prepare. Through education and public dialogue, they are equipping our people to make an informed, confident decision. And we are not starting from a blank page. Our grassroots organizations, Nashon Chamorro, Fuetsan Famalawan, and the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights, to We Are Guahan, Hagan Famalawan, Protehi Litexan, from People's Alliance for Responsive Alternative and People's Alliance for Dignified Alternatives, to the Guahan Coalition for Peace and Justice. Our grassroots organizations have kept the story moving. Their advocacy has ensured that our struggle remains rooted in culture, history, and identity. It is not only political, it is deeply personal. Over the last century, every petition, protest, and campaign has been part of this reauthoring process. We have refused to be defined by the structures we inherited. Instead, we've written forward through strategy, persistence, and vision. So as we mark this 75th anniversary, we don't simply commemorate the Organic Act. We confront the reality that the story is still unfolding. We ask ourselves, does the framework we've lived with reflect who we are today? How can we author a political future that truly reflects our values and our rights? And what must we build together to ensure that we shape the future on our own terms? The next chapter must be written deliberately. It demands political clarity, legal readiness, and collective resolve. Guam's future will not be handed to us. It must be authored by us. Sizuas Maasi.
Sizuas Maasi, Dr. Baza. As many of you know, this session hall that we're sitting in is a very big part of the physical history of the signing and the commemoration of the Organic Act. So I just want to acknowledge the Speaker Blas and the 38th Guam Legislature for welcoming us into the session hall and allowing us to host this event here. Before we bring up our last speaker, I do want to acknowledge that Justice Merriman has joined us, as well as Congressman Moylan, and also Linda Taitano-Regis, who's my former board chair, and also the daughter of the Honorable Carlos Taitano. Thank you for being here. Okay. Our last speaker is former Congressman Dr. Robert Underwood. He is, as you know, he served as our congressional representative and also as president emeritus of the University of Guam. He has a long record of educational leadership in Micronesia and is regarded as a leading authority on political status, indigenous issues, and sustainability in the Pacific. He has many publications and is regarded as a regular columnist for the Pacific area publications. He is an active member of the Armed Services Committee in Congress and has been appointed by 3 presidents to different councils and commissions. He was chair of the Congressional Asian American Caucus and led national efforts to include Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in educational initiatives, including the establishment of a major scholarship program. He is currently the chair of the Pacific Center for Island Security. Please help me in welcoming former Congressman Dr. Robert Underwood.
Buenas tardes. Half a day. Yeah, wow, that's a week, half a day. So anyways, you know, unlike the first 2 speakers, I actually didn't prepare anything. So I'm just going to kind of talk about it. So the first thing I was telling Melvin is I wanted to ask everybody who was born before the Organic Act to stand up, right? And he said, if you can. That's Melvin's line, not mine. So I'm included in that group, you know. So there's a kind of a different sense about history and the trajectory of history that encompasses that feeling. Of course, unlike most of the others who were I was also born before the Organic Act. I was born a U.S. citizen, courtesy of my father, and going back to my grandfather. So if someone says race doesn't matter, it matters. And in that sense, that's how I was a U.S. citizen. So the context for understanding this, and I want to congratulate Polly Eric and Dr. Lisa for their efforts. And we're kind of going backwards now. So we're trying to think, what is it that actually helped create the Organic Act of Guam? And how do we then build upon that which has been described by both Lisa and Polly Eric in order to move forward? It's pretty obvious. I think Polly Eric called it right. People aren't too excited about this. You know, this is something that has been around for a long time. It always struck me the very first time we had any kind of political status election was in 1976. And they offered, geez, I don't know, 8 options, you know, including being annexed to the state of Hawaii. And one option won 51% of the vote, even amongst all those options. And that option was status quo with improvements. Well, who doesn't want that? I want what I got now, only better. But it doesn't really define a future. It did not define that future. I'll tell you a personal story about 2 men that I knew fairly well. One was David Bonnier, who was the whip of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, and Fred Bordallo, my brother-in-law. And we had dinner together once. And he said, David was recounting, you know, my father had a meeting with FDR, President FDR. And Fred said, you know, my father had a meeting with President Roosevelt. And then we asked David, so what was that meeting like? And David said, when Roosevelt didn't want to talk about what you came to see him about, he asked you about fishing. So I asked Fred, what did your father say FDR talked about? Fishing. So since that time, there's been all of these conversations, and in almost every instance, when you get seriously involved with the federal government, they always want to talk about fishing. They don't want to talk about the subject at hand. Because the people of Guam have enormous authority and power and influence over this part of the world that they're not aware of. They simply are not aware of it. And of course, the best way to keep them from exercising that is to tell them that they got a good deal. And you got a better deal than everyone else. And you just sort of keep them happy and just bear with it. And the lessons that we've learned from the past, the lessons of the people who helped fashion the Organic Act. You know, we always like to call, I don't know who Mr. Organic Act is. I'm not sure whether it's Mr. Wampat or Mr. Leon Guerrero. I think it's Tunkiko Suilo who's called Mr. Organic Act. And then when they tried to have this kind of celebration in 1975, which would be the 25th anniversary of the Organic Act, they ran a Miss Organic Act contest. Believe it or not, you know, that seemed like always the thing to do. If you're going to have a Mr. Organic Act, you have to have a Miss Organic Act. Fortunately, nobody applied, so they never had this contest. But it sort of reminds me that sometimes we forget the history of our own people. You know, Connie Barrett, Tansong, had a lot to do with the Organic Act. And it's almost forgotten in this whole context. Of course, we know about Linda's father, Carlos Taitano, and we know about Mr. Wampat, and we know about Mr. Leon Guerrero. We sometimes forget that the person who made the motion to adjourn in order to walk out was Antonio Gaga Cruz from Baragada, and the man who seconded it was Jesus Okiyama. And we have to kind of remember those stories because they helped create energy, and they understood, in a sense, what was at risk, and they were motivated by grievance. And those grievances needed to be resolved. And the only way that they could resolve those grievances was through political action, and this is always a matter of interpretation. People assume that they thought that American citizenship would therefore give them the dignity that they needed, and then they would forever problems would be resolved. And of course, those problems about land and alienation of land continue to surface and go on no matter what. So in that process, is there enough grievance today to create a spark? Well, there's a lot of people who say they're aggrieved, but I don't know that there's a specific grievance, you know. Yeah, if you ask them, yeah, it's not right. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? And I'll write a letter to Donald Trump, see what he says, or I'll do this, or I'm going to do that. But it's not really the spark that is needed in order to generate a real political movement. So we're at that precipice now where we're called upon to, and you know, I was born before the Organic Act, so I realized that I'm getting on in years, but really called upon to kind of imagine what the world looked like to Mr. Wampat and Tun B.J. Bordallo and Tunkiko Suilo. Tunkiko Suilo, I always find it curious that, you know, they have a quote, I think, here in the museum in the back where it says, there's only one ism in Guam, and that's Americanism. And people always sort of interpret that as like, wow, this guy was super pro-American, and that's what he's doing. But there's a different interpretation to that. He was the one that was identified as being the most radical, the most difficult to deal with. And there were investigations conducted upon him. And Governor Paunal, upon all the consternation here in the walkout, filed reports back that people here are being radicalized. And you know, if you put that into the context of what was happening at the time and how we see that now, then you understand that there was something very special about that group of people that took those actions. Whether we're up to that or not, I'm not sure. I would like to say I'm up to it. I would like to think that others are up to it. But that involves a real serious challenge to the authority of the federal government. And indeed, as Polly Eric outlined, it may be the federal government that will wake up one day and say, you know, we just want to change the constellation here. You want to go? Okay, go ahead. Leave. Go ahead. Get out of the union. We don't. It seems unimaginable now. But the rate in which international politics is shifting, and in this part of the world, you never know what kind of arrangements that are going to be made in which Guam is not again going to be a main participant in those arrangements. So in my capacity as chair of the Pacific Center for Island Security, I try to keep track of some of the ideas that are being generated, and of course the movements of the U.S. military as they are, and the federal government in general. But in those think tanks back in Washington, D.C., they're thinking about ways in which the political status of Guam should change in very dramatic ways in which the people of Guam themselves are not thinking. And so that again, now that presents another set of opportunities. If you go back to the original Organic Act, one of the things that is most overlooked, I think we overlook it here, is that there was a lot of activity in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Guam that was fighting the Navy. There was a group called the Institute of Ethnic Affairs. Now, there's a DEI group, I've ever heard one. Institute of Ethnic Affairs. And Dr. Laura Thompson, the anthropologist who was here before the war, was involved in that, as was John Collier, as was Harold Ickes, as were people who spent the time writing letters to the editor. Richard Wells, who was a Navy Reserve officer here, he was just scandalized by everything that was going on. Went back, talked to his friend who happened to be an editor at the New York Times, Foster Haley, so they were able to generate letters. So these things are also important. So all of these things in combination, but it really has to begin with us here. And there are real grievances that have to be attended to. And the process of empowerment and the process of enlightening ourselves is a difficult one. It's true. You can ask a fifth grader on Guam, see who's smarter than a fifth grader. What is the capital of Guam? And a good number of them don't know that it's Hagatnya. They don't know. Is there a capital of Guam? Where is that? They don't know. So the sense of consciousness, the sense of awareness about who they are as part of this kind of magical tour in which our ancestors have given us and which we continue today is sometimes lost upon our youngest people. And, try as we can, try as much as we can. And so we'll provide the textbooks, we'll provide the reorientation, but it really needs that spark. It really needs that spark. And so I'm hoping that the Commission on Self-Determination, decolonization, used to be self-determination. That shows you how old I am. So I don't know what the new term's going to be after this one. But all of this will come to fruition in some fashion. And maybe one day, the next high official that we talk to won't talk about fishing. Thank you.
Sidzuis Maasi, Congressman Underwood. Please join me in giving a round of applause to all three of our speakers, and I'm going to welcome each one of them to come back up. Okay, if we can bring our speakers back up to have a seat at the table, we're going to start our panel discussion. While they come up, I'd like to I want to thank Dr. Baza for the kind words for the Commission on Decolonization. My team is right outside the lobby, and we have some educational information ready for each of you when you leave. So please make sure that you stop by on your way out before you join us across the street at the festival. Pick up a tote bag. It has some educational information on political status and the status options available to Guam. Thank you. Okay. We have some time left in our allotted schedule for this event, and we are going to engage in a informal discussion with our panelists. We have a series of themes for this discussion, but all three of them articulated this very clearly. I want to just say that I am very excited that the conversation that we're having today around the Organic Act is not just limited to the granting of U.S. citizenship. You know, that's obviously the memorable piece that a lot of people know about the Organic Act. But the Organic Act symbolized the beginning of our civil government. It symbolized our desire to govern ourselves, to lead ourselves, the belief in ourselves that we are deserving of this dignity and that we are capable of creating a modern organized government of Guam. So I want to thank all of you who work in the government, who have worked in the past in the government to help realize this vision and carry on this ideal. And I want to also thank our speakers for articulating this very well. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your thoughts and sharing your time and your knowledge with us. So we'll start first with Tomoto Advocacy for Greater Self-Government and Representation. You know, I like to joke that when we were organizing protests when I was in my 20s, it's always hard to get Tomotos to come out to a protest. And one time, Asaina told me that protesting is not our way. But when I think about the famous Guam Congress walkout, was that not a protest? And so I really believe that, you know, that this idea that we are willing to put ourselves out there, we are willing to stand up for what we believe in, that it is indeed our way. And we are absolutely willing to take our fight to the next level if necessary. And a lot of that began here in these halls. And so I wanted to start our discussion around this idea that this effort began with a demand and advocacy by the Tomoto people. So the passage of the Organic Act of Guam was the outcome of decades of engagement with the U.S. federal government by Tomoto people who advocated for a greater level of self-government and representation. Reflecting on this history, I'd like us to have a discussion on the role of activism and advocacy in the expression of Guam's political aspirations and the aspirations of the Tomoto people. So you've heard, and there's no particular order for this. Each one of you has a mic, and you can weigh in as you feel necessary. But each one of you had spoken in some way about the importance of advocacy and what our people did to push this forward. And you know, a lot of times we forget that there was work done even before the passage of the Organic Act. The earliest petition was in 1901.
Okay, I'll take a shot at it since I'm an activist and a very unsuccessful one because everything I've advocated for hasn't come to fruition. So most of the time I was arguing and demonstrating on behalf of the Chamorro language and then on behalf of Chamorro self-determination. Of course, advocacy is incredibly important because it keeps the flame alive in some parts of the society. But whether it really takes off is the result of some other greater circumstances. But the issue of the center of all of these movements is Chamorro identity. And the center of this movement is the kind of a general acknowledgement by the Chamorro people that they have this kind of unique, although it's not very unique, I mean, every people feel special, but unique history that goes back, I'd like to say 4,000 years or 3,500 years. And so that notion that there's some kind of continuity in that is really feeds that. And that was manifested in a number of ways, even in the Organic Act. A lot of people, and I use this as an example that Congress can do what it wants. A lot of people fail to remember that the original Organic Act gave preference in government of Guam hiring to what they called then persons of Guamanian ancestry. So Chamorros always were given a leg up in working for the government of Guam. Of course, to some extent, they still have a leg up, but I mean, legally they had a leg up. And so that indicates that there was always some capacity of Congress to recognize that. So, but it is at the core. It is at the core of everything that we think about Guam, I'll always joke with people because the word Chamorro and the word Guamanian. The Guamanian has had a kind of a interesting history. All the Chamorros all of a sudden became Guamanians after World War II, and then for maybe 20 years, then 25 years, then they said, maybe Guamanian doesn't work, and because everybody started to say they were Guamanian too, so then they went back to being Chamorro. So I always tell people, how many tattoos do you see on any young person that says, proud to be Guamanian, as opposed to proud to be Chamorro? Because that identity is incredibly strong, and it's articulated in ways and in communities and in locations that to some extent know very little about what it means to be Chamorro, but it is there. And so it has to be at the center of those things that we do.
Thank you, Dr. Underwood. Polly, would you like to weigh in?
I just want to point out that we might be seeing a little bit more interest in political status as the militarization of our island picks up pace, because the average young person or couple on Guam is being out-rented by the military. So it's adding to our homelessness situation. So people are beginning to feel the pain of these transitions. Whether they're able to connect that with political status realities is the question. So that's part of that whole awareness push that I think we need to do. Perhaps people will think this is maybe too negative a thought, or perhaps too outlandish a thought. But if you look at the economic and political situation of the native Hawaiians, who are at politically disadvantaged in terms of the ability to elect great numbers of Native Hawaiians, right, to political office, and the economic disadvantages that they face, are we 50, 100 years behind them, right? So I think one of the things that makes people very comfortable with the status quo in terms of Chamorro identity is that the vast majority of our politicians are Chamorro. Even though we're only, 30-some% of the resident population, but what percentage are we of the voters? But will that change in time? And will we face, perhaps everyone on this panel will be gone by then, but will we see a day where even the majority of our politicians may not be of Native ancestry?
So what I would like to add is that resistance and cooperation, they're fundamental aspects of human interaction. They coexist, and it's okay. You can be a GS-15 and still push for self-determination, survival, right, as a people. I don't think they're contrasting theories. They exist, you know. I got a grant from the federal government. I'm still gonna put up my activist hat on, and I'm gonna use that grant. Thank you.
I think that's a form of activism too. In Guam's early quest for greater self-government under the United States administration, Chamorro people had to both speak against the current system and work with their federal counterparts or federal administrators. How do you think Chamorro leaders strategically balanced resistance and cooperation in their advocacy for greater self-government and representation in the U.S. system? I know, yeah, I know you just answered that one. That's why I was asking. I wanted to get Congressman Apali to weigh in as well.
Well, I was never elected to office, so maybe.
That's a fair point.
Maybe
Well, you know,
many times.
Yeah, so what you've described seems like the story of my life, you know. So I used to say it's like being a non-voting delegate in the, and I'm sure Congressman Moylan shares this experience. Being a non-voting delegate in the U.S. House of Representatives is like being asked to pass legislation with one hand tied behind your back, and it's very tough. But there is the notion has to be stressed that the whole time I was in Congress, I kept talking about what I referred to as the Guam story. That's really the essence of representation. Not the fact that you were the same as other Americans, but you were different. If you're going to get something different, you have to explain why you're different, not why you're the same. And so there's, as a political argument or as part of political rhetoric, if you keep saying we're just the same as people in California, well, then what's the rub? What is it that will motivate people to think of you in different ways? And so you have to then tell the Guam story. It could be the stories related to the occupation, could be related to stories of people joining the military in large numbers, anything that is unique to the Guam experience and what you're going through is really the best kind of political advocacy. But it doesn't always work, you know, because the counter argument is like, I want to be I'm tired of being a second-class citizen. I want to be a first-class citizen. Well, yeah, I'm never sure what that means. What does that mean? What does that mean to say that you're a first-class citizen? You want to vote for president, and if you vote for president, does that make you a first-class citizen? That presents a whole kind of different motivation, and I think it's an inadequate one. It's not highly motivational. You know, it doesn't really motivate political change. And there's a lot of intricacies to that, because you have to be on your feet to say, Guam should, and I use this example a lot, you know, Guam should continue to draw from the Federal Highway Trust Fund in order to build the roads. All the numbered highways here are built from the Federal Highway Trust Fund. Do the people of Guam put into the Federal Highway Trust Fund? No, they don't put 1 cent into the Federal Highway Trust Fund, because that Federal Highway Trust Fund is paid for by the people who live in the 50 states when they pump gas. It's a tax that they pay. That goes into the Federal Highway Trust Fund. So you have to be quick on your feet in order to explain why you still should get access to that fund, regardless of the fact that you don't pay into it. And so that in the federal level. But in reality, it's really attitude. One of the things that, you know, this is an old story, and I'm sure people have heard it before, is that every time an elected official from Guam goes to D.C., they come back and they announce that they got this grant, or they got this much money, or they got this. as if they were, getting some kind of reward for going there. And one smart-ass reporter asked Governor Bordallo, he said, "Governor, don't you get tired of begging when you go to Washington, D.C.? And his answer is, "When I go to Washington, D.C., I don't go begging, I go collecting." Now, that's the kind of, that's what you do when you're in this kind of situation.
Well, I'm glad that he didn't go and talk about fishing. In Guam's early relationship with the United States federal government, Guam was under U.S. naval administration. So from 1898 to 1949, the U.S. Navy governed the island and our people. Reflecting on this time period, I'd like us to discuss the relationship between the Chamorro people and the U.S. naval administration and its comparisons to our relationship with the U.S. federal government today. How do you think the pursuit of U.S. citizenship and a civilian government prior to 1950 reflected both Chamorro aspirations and frustrations under the U.S. naval administration? And in what ways do you think these efforts shaped the eventual passage of the Organic Act of Guam?
Well, if you ask my grandmother, the Navy was the best thing that happened to Guam. My grandmother would say, born in 1899, is how clean the streets of Aganya were and how orderly everything was, and there was no trash in anybody's yard, and she had that nostalgia for the Navy administration. And yet, she was the one who told me, Chamorro y lenguajimo, Tamo malelefa. So she had that mixture of Chamorro pride and yet a great patriotism to the United States. But reading up on the story of like F.B. Leon Guerrero, found an old newspaper story that he actually got in trouble for the first time with the American administration in the 1920s, because he wasn't expecting a visitor. He was working for the Agricultural Extension office down in Pidi, and he wasn't expecting an American visitor, an American naval official, and he had his feet up on the desk. And so the official came in asking for so-and-so, and he didn't put his feet down. And so he was reprimanded. And this is where awareness is so important. In FB's own self-defense, he said, "I don't work for the U.S. Navy. I work for the Department of Agriculture. So I don't have to stand up and greet you." So he used knowledge, he used his awareness of his rights and who he was, and even within the framework of the federal government to defend himself. So I've always found this kind of mixed feelings among our people. I think if you had a ballot that said complete separation from the U.S. or a better political status with the U.S., I think the second would win. Because our people are just so attached to the United States. But we want some greater say in what happens to our own island because we're the ones who feel it.
Well, and of course, naval government is full of stories. The other story about F.B. Leon Guerrero is that the governor came to his area and he gave him the reins and he said, "I'm not taking the reins." He was riding a horse. And also, Governor Bradley, he was naval governor, and later on he became a congressman from California, a Republican, and very strong conservative critic of President Truman. But when they came up to the conversation about naval government on Guam, he said, "The worst civil government is better than the best military government." And that was his, and he repeated that because he felt that the people of Guam should be running the show. So in a sense, waiting for someone to kind of grant you that authority, you're going to wait a long time. So you have to kind of wrest it in some fashion. And of course, the greatest counter argument to wresting that control is to tell you that if you keep wresting for this control, we're going to cut you off and you're no longer going to be part of America and you're no longer going to get these benefits. So there's that kind of counterbalance. There is a lot, there's, you know, I've heard a lot of, just like Pali here, I've heard a lot of nostalgia about pre-war Guam, you know, because, you know, the grass, everybody cut their grass all the time. And that was because if your grass grew this tall, you were fine. So, you know, so the people would go around and fine you. But on the other hand, the grass got cut, you know. And they had things like, in order to tell you which tree you were cutting tuba from, which you were then had to pay a tax, they would paint a white stripe around the tree. Then before long, painting a white stripe around the tree became decorative. And everybody started planting coconut trees and then painting a white stripe around it, courtesy of the Navy. So there were those kinds of things going on, but it was ultimately degrading to people. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that system of government degraded people, degraded their sense of authority and efficacy. And as always, at the base of that was the fact that Guam was just seen as a base. It was just a military facility. And that's all it was. And it was orderly, but it was nothing but a military base. So it's true. That has to be kind of like a consciousness that we have to deal with. You know, if people ask for more autonomy over their lives, do they really want autonomy over their lives? That's an important question. Do they really want that autonomy? And are they afraid of it? So, you know, in the whole decolonization of the Pacific, where these small Pacific islands became independent nations, Guam is one of the few places that you can threaten with independence. It's like, if you don't watch it, we're going to make you independent. And then you go, oh no, don't do that, you know. So there's that kind of psychology that's at work. And, you know, it's hard to deal with that because you want people to feel the full growth of their own potential. And that is keeping us, I believe, from reaching that.
I would just like to say that there was a lot of resistance, and the Chamorro people did not assimilate. And the directives and the orders depended on what U.S. naval governor was in charge. And just like the military today, they come in and out every 2 years, they transition. You know, so they attempted to do separation of church and state. They attacked our faith, and the Chamorros did not. They discouraged the use of the Chamorro language. There was a lot of land takings in eminent domain. Yes, we cooperated. You know, it was a time of survival, but we resisted and we did not assimilate. And that language is still alive today, despite the fact that, you know, I speak brokenly of it, but it's still alive today.
Yeah, we keep a copy of the English-only sign at our administrative office up at Department of Chamorro Affairs so that we are reminded regularly.
And that was one of the first laws that was passed by the first Guam legislature. just to remind ourselves of that.
Right.
And when the first Guam legislature was, one of the first laws that they passed was to make English the official language. But they still kept speaking Chamorro around it. I don't know. But it speaks to that kind of dual apprehension of the world, I think, that Pali Eric has talked about. A little confusion there.
In your opinion of the passage of the Organic Act, do you think that Guam's system of governance reflects the fundamental principles of the American government that were referred to in the 1901 petition? I want to just read a quote from the 1901 petition. It said, quote, "A military government at best is distasteful and highly repugnant to the fundamental principles of civilized government, and peculiarly so to those on which is based the American government. Its only legitimate excuse for existence is military necessity or as a provisional government, end quote.
Well, you know, those signers of that 1901 petition had lived under a military government, but under the flag of Spain. So they knew exactly what living on this island as if it were a military base was like.
The thing about, also to recognize about those signers is that, and so some people can dismiss those signers as part of an elite group of tomorrow, but these were fairly well-educated people. So they had learned this from someplace. And and again, that goes back to kind of like the intuitive understanding of who they were as a people. You know, they don't have to implement the 1901 petition, just have to implement the Declaration of Independence, you know, which is the core document which helped create the United States. You know, that you hold certain inalienable rights. As people, you hold these inalienable rights. But the Organic Act carefully crafted the Constitution and its application to Guam, so that it made sure that some parts of the Constitution didn't apply to Guam, like the 10th Amendment, obviously. The 10th Amendment gives powers back to the states that are not held by the federal government, so they didn't want to give those powers to the government of Guam. So they held back certain parts of those provisions. They also said clearly in the Organic Act that Guam is an unincorporated territory. So that, even though we think of the insular cases as creating the legal framework for the creation of unincorporated territories indeed, but in Guam's case, it was part of the legislation that created the Organic Act. So that becomes a kind of a legal status because they wanted to make it clear that there was no possibility of statehood and no possibility of change in the political status other than that authorized by the U.S. Congress. But those things were kind of, you know, at the time, most people were just sort of relieved and happy to become U.S. citizens, thinking that that would resolve certain issues. But you know, it didn't resolve issues like even leaving Guam. You still had to wait until 1962 and get permission from the military in order to go somewhere and come back, even if you were a U.S. citizen. And there's letters, you know, I was looking through papers of my own aunts and uncles who were all born U.S. citizens. And they all had to write a letter to the governor to ask the Navy to ask permission to leave. Will you grant me permission to leave? And so that was that whole process. And my grandfather, Underwood, went on a trip in 1958, and when he was in Honolulu, the Navy wouldn't let him get on the plane because they said, you don't have the right papers to go to Guam. And here he was not only, of course, he was originally from North Carolina, he had been a POW during World War II. He had all this kind of history behind him. And, you know, some junior grade officer wouldn't let him get on the plane. So those are kind of symbolic of that power. Now, some of you say, well, those days are gone. Thank God those days are gone. Well, are they? Are there other things that are going on today, such as the creation, all this the militarization of the office, the island, which people are questioning? Aren't those things sort of the same thing that happened in the past? And what about the elected officials who are in office today? You know, people are going to ask, where were you when all of this was going on? And what were the people of Guam saying? And why didn't you counter it? Why didn't you speak up? Those are the questions that are going to be, and they're going to come. They're going to come because the problems that are associated with this, related to housing, related to land use around the missile batteries, all of these things that are ongoing are going to kind of manifest themselves as these plans get implemented, and people are going to say, oh, I didn't know that that's what that meant. And then they're going to ask, well, where was our political leadership? So that is really at the source of this. So, you know, we live in a military island, and that's really, it's just watching the tsunami. You know, I had the good fortune or misfortune, depending on how you look at it, of turning on Fox News the day before yesterday. And the weather guy was saying, there's a tsunami that's hitting the Pacific, and it's going to hit Guam, where all our military bases are. And that's the perception. That's our identity. That's who we are. That's how we are seen. And that's our role in life. And I think at some point in time, even if there's not that tomorrow sense of identity in the young people, I think young people are starting to think, you know, there has to be more than this for our future. There has to be more.
No. The fundamental principle of, you know, of the U.S., right? U.S. government is sovereignty, and we're not there. You know, we still have to make changes to the Organic Act. We have a process that we need to go through. We still have a non-voting delegate, so in response to the question, no. And you know, it is a process. You know, you're the decolonization director, right? So this is a process, and it's continuous.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think that the big challenge Dr. Underwood referenced, the referendum in the 70s, where the top voting option was status quo with improvements, and ambiguous improvements. Nobody really knew what that meant. I think most people probably assumed it was an increase in resources, and I think Dr. Underwood stated it pretty accurately. Who doesn't want what you have and a little bit more? But not knowing what the little bit more is, I think, is the critical piece. And I think where we are today represents the evolution of our political consciousness as an island. You know, we've gone through several versions of the discussion around political status, and only in recent years have we, you know, really narrowed it down and made a very clear decision that we only recognize 3 legitimate political status options. And I think it's very, I thought it was very, there was a lot of foresight from a lot of our political leaders. I see some of the creators of the Organization of People's Indigenous Rights, which was really our first representation for Guam at the international level, the United Nations. And if you read the law that created the Commission on Decolonization, that defined the framework for a political status referendum, what you see is a very clear determination that an ambiguous status quo with improvements is not, in fact, the framework for moving into the future. And that there are, you know, we're not the first nation to be confronted with these challenges. And so I think it was very, I think that there's a lot of, there's a lot of value in the political mindset and the strategic thinking of our leaders who crafted this law. Auntie Hope is sitting right in front of me, whose name is signed on that bill. And it's a fantastic thing to know that our community, you know, our elected officials, or we live in a representative democracy. The movement was generated by our community. And I think our community was clear in saying that we want something that is well defined, that meets the full standards, the full measure of self-government. And that's why we don't recognize any other, you know, the United Nations, I get called out a lot that there is another United Nations resolution, I can't even remember the reference, but there's a resolution that says that there's a fourth, this mysterious fourth political status option. And it's basically any other political status option that the administering power, in this case the United States, agrees upon with the territory. The problem with that reference is that there's no defined framework for how that ambiguous or, new mysterious status meets the full measure of self-government. And that's what the options in our current law represent. All the options, whether they be integration, otherwise known as statehood, free association, or independence, all meet the standards of a full measure of self-government through different mechanisms. So I definitely think it's an exciting thing. When you think about where we've come, how far we've come, and the challenges that we have faced as a community, to have this framework built despite the challenges. And, the Davis case, we can have a whole new critical conversations on that alone. But, ultimately, I think that there's still an appetite for political status resolution. I think all of you have kind of stated this pretty clearly, that, it has to be led by our community. There's still this question, is there interest? I think that there is. I mean, we got a pretty good crowd here. I'm happy to see so many of you. I didn't think we were going to fill out this room this much. Thank you for being here. I want to go ahead and move on to the next discussion topic, which is the Organic Act's impact and limitation on Guam's current level of self-government. The Organic Act provided the people of Guam with a form of civil government based on representation through elected officials within the Guam legislature, a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress, and a governor within the executive branch. These institutions have served to provide our people with a set of tenets central to a government that is based on a representative democracy. Reflecting on this, I'd like us to discuss the significance of elected representation towards our island's development and the limitations to full self-government under the Organic Act. In 1972, Guam has had the opportunity to elect a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives. Unlike their colleagues in Congress, our delegate lacks voting power. In your opinion, how has the lack of voting power affected our delegates' ability to effectively advocate for Guam's unique needs and interests in terms of funding opportunities or access to key federal programs? I'm going to default ask you to start, Dr. Underwood, since this is relevant to your experience.
Well, that's a question of, that requires a lot of, I've thought a lot about the answer to that question over the course of trying to explain what it means to be a non-voting delegate. It's such an elegant title, isn't it? Non-voting delegate. That's the official title of the office. You're non-voting delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. But it's like I try to tell people what it's like. It's like your high school senior class. It's like you have 200 or 300 people there that you get to know, and you work with them, and you're wondering, some of them are really dumb, some of them are really smart. Some of them are like really borderline corrupt, and you form different alliances. But it's like any human group of people. So in terms of the actual work of legislation, you can affect legislation depending upon how you work in that environment. And do people start seeing you as a valuable member of the body and of committee work? And I think to some extent I was able to succeed at that. But at the end of the day, you're a non-voting delegate, And so, they have, when they call a vote, you could be in a committee. This hits you on that. If you're in a committee and they call a vote, you don't go. Everybody else in the committee gets up and you're there sitting, looking around, and you're looking at the staff, and you're getting yourself a cup of coffee, and you're kind of reminded about your status. They used to have people running the elevators, and then, they're always in a rush, because if there's a vote, everything, like, you have to get people into the elevator and so on. And one time I was getting in the elevator, and the elevator operator told me, "Oh, you don't vote." which was like the ultimate reality check on who you are. Now, but having said that, you still have representation. You're still members of committee. You're still doing things. You're still able to do the same thing. And you know, I was talking to, well, not so much to Mr. Wampat, but Mr. DeLugo, Ron DeLugo from the Virgin Islands. When they first came to Congress, when they were first elected, the question was whether they were going to pay them the same as, you know, representatives. Or are they going to get paid the same? And they finally decided, yeah, they should get paid the same. What a relief. And then my colleague from American Samoa, Eni Faleoma Vaenga, everything in Congress, in the House, is organized by seniority. If you get on an airplane, and even if it's congressional travel, you know, the leadership sits in the front, then the seats are assigned on the plane in descending order to the person with the least seniority. Well, the Air Force organizes that, but sometimes they don't know. What do you do with a delegate? Are they like, do they get seniority? Are they, you know? So Eni and I used to kid each other. I say, we're going on a trip. I say, Eni, where did they put you on the plane? Did they put you just ahead of staff? He goes, yeah. So on one of these trips, one of these staffers on the House Armed you have to curry favor with. So every bill you have, every motion you have has to get approval from the Democrats and the Republicans. It's not enough to just get approval from one side. So you learn how to be bipartisan by necessity, not by inclination.
Thank you for sharing your experience.
Well, I don't know that they're here. They're here to learn about the Organic Act.
Well, I think it's important. But I wanted to also extend this into the community. Of course, we live in a democratic system of representative democracy, and it's built, in the image of the United States system. For our other two panelists, how do you imagine this gap in our form of representative democracy minus voting representation? How does that affect us on a community level as we put our faith in our elected officials, we depend on them to deliver on our expectations, but as Congressman Underwood explained, our elected officials are often kind of starting at a disadvantage.
Well, I don't know if it's germane to the question, but it is certainly a limitation that we surrendered all say over immigration, right? And I don't think the people in 1950 could have foreseen what that situation would have turned out to be. Because even in 1950, as Congressman said, my father experienced in 1959, he couldn't just fly here. I mean, so even for stateside, right? So immigration was controlled, but it was controlled by the federal government. And so our leaders in the 50s couldn't foresee what immigration turned out to be. And I really wonder if they could have foreseen, would they have voiced something differently in 1950?
Yes, I'm kind of digressing here, but since you brought it up, that's one of the things that stands out to me the most in the Guam Commonwealth era, was that the people of Guam voted and adopted the Guam Commonwealth Draft Act, and then Governor Adat presented the Commonwealth Draft Act to Congress, and it never even made it out of committee. And at that time, Congress was willing to sign the Guam, adopt the Commonwealth Draft Act for Guam, but only if we were willing to remove the article on mutual consent for military activities and the article on immigration. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak.
Well, the House version of the Organic Act, which was passed first, went to the Senate, and the Senate took out a clause that allowed only Guam natives to be landowners. So they took that out in the Senate version, and that was eventually passed. So what people, I think, understand is that if we want continued political association with the United States, we have to make certain sacrifices to be part of the American political family. The question is, are we willing to make those sacrifices? If so, so be it.
Ironically, that continues to be one of the strengths of this CNMI covenant, but even CNMI eventually gave up control of immigration.
The experience in the CNMI was a lesson to us.
Right.
Yeah, different.
Yeah.
Would you like to weigh in on this?
I think there are two questions, but my notes say defer to Dr. Underwood, but we do have a non-voting delegate. But I do understand that, in committees, you're very influential in changing some of the language that address Guam War reparations, which under the World War II Loyalty Act, eventually in 2016, that required an amendment that was made by Dr. Underwood, right? But in terms of Commonwealth, so we did have a favorite option. It was Commonwealth, and it was proposed, and it was rejected, which just further tells us that, whatever it is that we come up with still needs to be approved by Congress. But, I think Eric, you talked about immigration was the backbreaker there. They didn't want us to, immigration, taxes, trade. We won't talk about trade and that's a whole different discussion, right? And labor laws, which which they did not want to negotiate with us, But there were other changes made too. I think it was Senator Titan who attempted to make changes, right, to the Organic Act, and there were proposals to the amendments, and that wasn't even addressed, right? So we don't have, we continue to be under the rule of, under the mercy of the U.S. Congress, and until that changes, we are living in a status quo.
Someone described our present government as student council, but the principal calls the shots.
That is a very accurate analogy. Yeah, I mean, this is what...
While I agree with that, General, I wouldn't want to overstate the fact that there have been a lot of political leaders that have done different things that were ultimately good for the island. And also to kind of add, so that's another historical interpretation, since I worked hard to get a committee hearing on the Commonwealth. So it was one of the most well-attended, most of the time you have committee hearings and you're lucky if 3 people show up. I got 26 people to show up. So, but, it took a lot of work. I had to go keep talking to people. And, obviously it was true that immigration and I think it was more mutual consent, actually. It was Article 1 that was actually the burr in the saddle. But the thing that also was part of it, and not to besmirch my Puerto Rican friends, but Puerto Rico, the political status of Puerto Rico, which the Republicans really wanted to advance towards statehood, kind of made them hesitant to really address anything, give something to Guam that Commonwealth advocates in Puerto Rico would say, they gave that to Guam. See, we can have what the PIP party used to say, enhanced Commonwealth. We can have enhanced Commonwealth. So there was that, and so that was a kind of a different issue. So I say that so that we don't think that it's only us. There's a whole bunch of other things that are going on at the same time. And people did provide some leadership, and we've had great governors, we had so-so governors, we've had great legislatures, we've had so-so legislatures. All of these things are kind of part and parcel of day-to-day governance. The Guam Organic Act gave that process. What are we commemorating? I don't know that we're celebrating, but we're kind of commemorating the Organic Act and the 75th anniversary of the creation of the government of Guam. Now, Gov Guam, that's a whole other reality unto itself. But Gov Guam is what we have fashioned as a result of this. And so for better or for worse, Gov Guam is our home government. And we want, and Judy Guthertz always reminds me of this, we have to kind of protect, Gov Guam as our mama, That's really what keeps sort of a kind of political balance here on the island. So we can highlight the fact that it is weak and that it doesn't have certain powers, but it has done things for the island.
Absolutely. I don't think that it's in any way disrespectful to the momentous milestone, but I do think it is our responsibility to recognize the intent and the visionary attitude of our elected officials, our community leaders at the time that were advocating for a greater measure of self-government. This morning there was a flag-raising ceremony at Adelup. And I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of thinking that, oh man, we're just gonna go and raise the flag and sit under the canopy. But I was really excited that the way that the program was devised was this recognition of the creation of the different elements of government of Guam. They started with the first agencies, the first offices that were created in 1950, and then sequentially recognized each and every department, agency within the government. And it was exciting to see, the kind of evolution of the way that our people were thinking about governing ourselves, the way that we are, creating these different organizations within the government to address something that was really urgent, really critical, really important at that time. But one of the things that I always kind of take notice of whenever it's proclamation time is whenever the governor signs, governor will always say, "Now the power vested in me by the Organic Act of Guam as amended." And I always like that part at the end, as amended. Because if you know the history of the Organic Act of Guam, there are certain elements of our government today that were not allowed or authorized through the original version of the Organic Act. And I think it's a very telling thing about our government, our people, and our frame of mind that, I don't think that anybody on Guam was ever fully satisfied with the Organic Act of Guam as it was in 1950. I think that everybody understood that this is meant to be a living document until such time that we are granted a full measure of self-government. And so it's always a very exciting thing to think about these little nuances. I know this kind of gets lost on a lot of people, but not you guys. That's why you're here, because you're thinking about these things. I want to go ahead and move on to the next item for discussion. Since the signing of the Organic Act, our island and its people have taken on numerous efforts to grow within our current territorial framework and beyond it towards a full measure of self-government and defined political status. I'd like us to discuss regarding these efforts, through which our island has grown politically and how other efforts have encountered resistance. In your view and understanding of Guam's history, what factors have contributed to benefit Guam's growth politically, and what factors have accounted for Guam's apparent latency to grow further? They're signaling for you.
That's a political science question.
We can talk about, right, is in terms of the Elective Governor Act, that was, one of the changes, right, through the years. Having a non-voting delegate, that was an issue. The return of federal lands, streamlining, the return of federal lands in 1996. And so there have been, a lot of changes, creating a tripartite government, right, with a judicial, legislative, and executive. And at the time, the governor was appointed by the U.S. president, but that changed too. At the time, the legislative body was an advisory board, and that, I think it's still an advisory, I'm just kidding. That has made there's been substantial changes to that. And I think one of the biggest changes, of course, would be judicial reform, with the establishment, many amendments later, of the Supreme Court, right? Moving away from the district court and establishing the Supreme Court of Guam as a co-equal branch of government, right, with the powers that they have. Status quo, other things. I'm going to defer to Dr. Underwood and probably Eric.
Well, there have been a lot of changes, of course, but the basic political structure of the island is still highly dependent upon congressional action. So everything you do is really an amendment to the Organic Act. Every piece of legislation that is passed in Guam, in Congress related to Guam, is an amendment to the Organic Act. So it's important to remember that in the beginning, even the federal district court had jurisdiction over felonies and not just, and I think civil cases over $5,000. I forgot the exact amount. So there's been a lot of changes in that whole structure. There was no trial by jury. So there was, they had to make those changes over time. But the base understanding is that the government doesn't come from the consent of the governed. That's really the issue. So that's really the framework to understand. So, if you go to the House of Representatives, everywhere you go, there's a quote. You drive, walk around, and there's a quote by somebody, some previous president or something. And over the credit union office, which I used to visit quite regularly, there was a quote by William Henry Harrison, and it said, "The only legitimate right to govern comes from the consent of the governed." So William Henry Harrison is famous for, being in office like 60 days or something. He got pneumonia, and then he died. But the other thing that William Henry Harrison was unique about is he's the only territorial delegate who ever become president. So he was a territorial delegate. So he understood the meaning of that. The only legitimate right to govern comes from the consent of the governed. And that is so clearly not applicable to Guam. That is so clearly out of scope for the island because there has been no general agreement on what that framework should be like. And in the context of the decolonization movement, which is a worldwide movement, the options are made clear. And we have to exercise one of those options in order to get out of this box. And of course, statehood would be an option that a lot of people would like. But, it's like, joining a club, and the members want to decide whether you can be a member of that club. They have that sort of right to decide that. But that is the fundamental quandary that the island is in. And so as a result of that, there's almost every decision that is made will engender grievance, engender in bitterness, and everyone will always be dissatisfied. And of course, the fulfillment of that process remains ahead. So it's really important to understand that the Organic Act was a major step, a major improvement, all those things, but there are many, many steps ahead that have to be taken.
And one of the next steps is it's got to get really painful before people move. That just seems to be part of our psyche, right? Good or bad, right? Maybe it makes sense to wait until it's typhoon condition to take, action. And the action that is very typical of us is petition and protest, right? So if you don't like the priest, petition, right? And protest goes way back, right? So the Tweed protest in '45 and the protests across the street of the cathedral a few years ago. But it has to wait until people really feel pain. That's when they move. And it's not everybody. It's not like 5,000 people at the plaza protesting. It's 200 very vocal people who are so inflamed that they'll walk in the sun or the rain to protest. But it gets attention, and it has some effect.
I agree. It wasn't that long ago that we hosted the Finogi March, and we had about 2,000 people assemble and march from the governor's office to the federal court in response to the outcome of the Davis case. We hear a lot in Guam when we use organic synonymously with constitutional. So whenever in Guam you hear people say, "Oh, that's inorganic," it's equivalent to unconstitutional because for all intents and purposes, the Organic Act serves as our, the replacement for or the supplement for the Guam Constitution. There have been past efforts to create a Guam Constitution. In 1979, the majority of Guam's electorate voted in opposition to the draft constitution for Guam. The outcome of the vote was a culmination of efforts made by grassroots organizations to reject the constitution in favor of resolving Guam's territorial status first. In your opinion, why was it important then, and how is it still relevant today to resolve our political status first before the implementation of a constitution for our island?
Well, back in those days, I was only 15 years old, but I was in this legislative hall almost every day. Yeah. And it was said that we're putting the cart before the horse, and that convinced enough people. It started off with a para. I forget what it stood for, and then a para came there, joined then and became Parapada, and it was explained to me that it's Parapada, you know, to swat it away, to swat away the Constitution, and to resolve the question of political status first.
Well, I was one of the organizers, so it's more or less, that's an accurate rendition of it. The point being that, just to kind of go back to the UN, the role of the United Nations in our lives, which most people, I think, just reflexively discount. So the only time that the United States ever invited a UN delegation to come to Guam was for that constitutional convention election. And they invited them to come to Guam because they assumed that if the Constitution passed, they could then go back to the United Nations and say, see, these people are not now fully self-governing, so you have to take them off the non-self-governing list. So they invited three people from the UN from different nations to come, and then they also had a UN staffer named Mr. Swai, who was from Tanzania. So he spoke Swahili, so it was actually me and Tony Leon Guerrero, the late Tony Leon Guerrero, who were really active on it. So he said to Tony, he goes, I'm going to call you Simba. And he said, so Tony said Simba, says, because it means lion. And of course, Tony had this kind of beard, right? So he said, Tony, and then he said to me, I'm going to call you Mwamba. And I said, well, what's that mean? He goes, rock. I said, because I'm hard-headed or something like that. But that delegation then came, and it had exactly the opposite effect. Because when that delegation came, that was the first time it occurred to me that there was a defined role for Guam at the United Nations. And of course, that followed up with 2 years later going to the United Nations and presenting Guam's case. So that constitutional convention and then the defeat of the Constitution had that kind of effect on it. And so it's a kind of an important historical item. Virgin Islands also had the same constitution opportunity. I think, so people are constantly saying, why don't we just vote on the Constitution again? Well, the Virgin Islands, I think, has voted...
I think they're on their sixth version.
They're on their sixth version of the Constitution, and it can't pass. So I'm assuming that it's the same kind of situation would likely occur here, is that no matter what you do with the Constitution, and of course the Constitution would then be vetted in terms of, the applicability of U.S. law and sovereignty and all the other things approach to it. So it was, putting the carabao before the cart. And, it convinced this 15-year-old. I'm glad to hear that. But that was the dynamic of that, And of course, there were a lot of conditions going on, claims and counterclaims. But the importance of that is that it really brought the role of the United Nations into focus. At least for me, for the first time, I knew about it, but I never really understood it until the gentleman who was part of the U.S. delegation to the UN agreed to invite them in, and they came. And of course, there were a lot of dramatic things, I don't know if people remember David Sablan. I don't know if you remember David Sablan, the artist. He went to a meeting with that gentleman from person from the State Department. He threw his medals in and said, that's it, I'm done. He got medals from his Vietnam War experience. So there was a lot of emotion attached to that. And of course, the people had to make a decision. But I think probably Pali Eric is right. We need people to be not just emotionally caught up or aggrieved, there has to be some great discomfort that's going to create the movement that will finally get us to change. And I want you to know I'm pretty unhappy and discomfort. So I'm ready.
There's a lot of people here in the audience who probably, you know, Auntie Hope, you really should be sitting right here so I can go use the restroom. But in terms of, you know, like how do you write the Constitution if we have not resolved our status option, right? Because it will look differently if we go with independence, you know, free association, we go with statehood. So, you know, how can you begin to write that Constitution?
I absolutely agree with that. You know, a lot of people use that reference as this benevolent gift. Oh, Congress has already authorized Guam to write a constitution. Why don't we just do that? You know, you guys don't want to do it, so you're just, you know, stuck in this position. But, you know, also we kind of conveniently forget the fact that the congressional authorization for the drafting of a constitution comes with the caveat that it must recognize U.S. sovereignty, federal U.S. sovereignty over Guam. And so what kind of constitution are we really writing? I mean, even, you know, the United States of America is a collection of sovereign states under one nation. So even states are sovereign within their borders, you know, which is a fundamental difference than a territory. And so even the constitution that we've been authorized to write is by nature an inferior constitution. And to Dr. Baza's point, you know, there's a difference between a state constitution and a compact of free association and a constitution of an independent nation. And so I think it was, you know, showed a lot of foresight by our community to recognize, you know, these very important distinctions and details as we navigate our path. And I just wanted to, as a side note, to Dr. Underwood's comment, the UN visiting mission that he referred to was the last and only visiting mission that was ever authorized for Guam. And I can tell you from personal experience, we go out to the United Nations every year, and every year our request is the same: for a UN visiting mission to Guam to assess the situation on our political self-determination and the granting of our ability to choose a path. And it is the mandate of the Special Committee on Decolonization at the United Nations to fulfill any requests made by a territory for a visiting mission, but they will only do it with the permission of the administering power. And the United States has never agreed to authorize a visiting mission except to witness the passing of a constitution, which unfortunately for them did not happen. We are nearing the end of our allotted time, but I did want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to address the path forward. So I want to give each one of you a chance to give some final words and hopefully give us an idea or your perspective on where our community fits into all of this. What role do our listeners at home play, and how does this affect them? How can each of us contribute to advancing this cause to resolution?
Mine is a very simple comment, and I'm a great believer in the old-fashioned village meeting. You know, and I think if we have just more village meetings, you know, 20, 30 villagers with a panel, and educate our people, bring to light these issues that are there but are not talked about, I think that's a step in the right direction.
I would like to say something in the vernacular, like they used to say when I was a kid. You know, if somebody wanted to say something really significant, they say, "I want to say something in the vernacular." Pues para hamzo parahita ni man autoguam parahita ni man samoro. David itahasos at considera na na klasen kinalamtin, na kinalamtin gine para dignidad gine ni pinaposta. Todo desya imananata ni man mamumudzihet, cosa que sinya man gaigihet gine gipresente na estao. Lo paso por paso mona. David yugwa mas fit mi na paso para man mamayla sa na tempo ginaan niya, dan ginaan ifamaguon ta, dan ifamaguon niya. pues para todo no sea una razón, na debita pitsigisti, la debita considera hafta mano para tana lotla, es un espíritu que cada uno gizahita. Viva Chamorro.
Dr. Baza says we can end with that, and I agree. Sedulis Maasi, Polly Forbes, Congressman Underwood, and Dr. Baza, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experiences and your expertise. Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you so much. Okay, before you folks start making your way out to the festival, I just wanted to let you know that there's this beautiful exhibit put together by Kumishoni Finot Samoru. It chronicles Guam's self-determination journey. The the exhibit starts right here in this corner and circles around the session hall. And before you leave, please stop by our table to the left on your exit out of the session hall and pick up your copy of some educational information. There's a lot of information on each of the political status options for Guam and the impact to our local government. And you get a nifty little canvas tote bag that you can use to put all your stuff from the festival into. Thank you again for being here with us. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion, and please join us at the festival across the street. Have a great day. Adios.